Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Lindsay Cookson, and I'm the Water and Science Program Coordinator with the Lake Champlain Committee. On behalf of the Lake Champlain Committee and Tetra Tech, we are really excited to be offering this Benthic webinar series. And thank you for those who were able to join us last week. If you were unable to, the recording has been posted, and I did put the link in the chat. I will be sending around an email at the end of July with all of those recordings included and some of the slides that people were asking for as well. As a reminder, this webinar series is made possible through funding by the Lake Champlain Basin Program, and I'm really excited for their, really grateful and excited for their support. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. The presentation will last about 25 minutes and will be followed up by a question and answer section. You are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A or the chat feature. I like the chat feature, it's just a little bit easier. And we will answer as many as possible at the end once we hit after the presentation. It is being recorded, as I mentioned before, and will be posted on our website following the presentation. I do ask that you just stay muted throughout, and you're welcome to unmute during the question and answer section as well. But I will be reading the questions out loud, so it's easier in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Hannah Bonner. Dr. Bonner is an assistant professor at Brigham Young University, and she'll be presenting Benthic Cyanobacteria, a perspective from Utah lakes, streams, and rivers. Please join me in welcoming Hannah, and thank you so much for being here today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay, and hi, everyone. So grateful to have you join and looking forward to talking about benthic cyanobacteria together. Let me just pull up my screen. Okay, wonderful. And it seems like we have a pretty cozy group today. So I think my approach here is I am going to do a high-level overview of a few different things, and then I am more than happy to go into detail about specifics or more nuances on any of these topics as is useful for this group. I think just to give a bit of introduction to start with, I am honestly right between two careers. For the last 4 years, I worked for the state of Utah as the lead for Utah's cyanobacteria harmful algae program. So I have a lot of thoughts and perspective on more of the state, the water manager side of things. And then in April, I switched to my current position as a professor at Brigham Young University, where a lot of my research is now digging into these questions that haunted me as a water manager, and also really looking forward to be able to do science to support applied decision making. So in terms of my presentation today, I want to draw from both of these worlds. And first of all, just give you some overview of benthic cyanobacteria in Utah, some of the lessons we've learned, the tools we developed for our state that hopefully are applicable for the questions and the issues you're facing. And then also talk briefly about the direction my research is going now, and some of our insights so far on what controls benthic cyanobacteria growth and toxin risk. So to start with, let's talk about benthic cyanobacteria in Utah. And it feels like every state or agency you talk to has their own benthic cyanobacteria story. And for us, ours goes back to July 4th, 2020. This picture was taken in Zion National Park on the Virgin River. And on that day, this little boy, his mom, and their pet dog were playing in the Virgin River, normal, good time, swimming and splashing, when suddenly their dog started to exhibit really unusual symptoms, staggering, seizures, difficulty breathing. The family rushed the dog to the vet, but tragically, within about 20 minutes of displaying symptoms, the dog was dead. Understandably heartbroken, the family reached out to the park and shared their experience. And National Park Service scientists visited the sites and found lots of benthic cyanobacteria mats. We vaguely were aware of benthic cyanobacteria in Utah prior to this, but really didn't have it on our radar at all as a public health concern. I'd say this is pretty true of most states in the United States at this time. No one had an established monitoring program or any sort of public health structure for responding to this kind of event. And this was really concerning both for the state of Utah and for Zion, because first of all, anatoxin, the toxin behind this death, is not something to mess around with. I assume this group already has some familiarity with cyanotoxins, but just a high level refresher, anatoxin is a really potent neurotoxin, and it actually is the most common toxin we see in our benthic cyanobacteria mats. There's a lot of big pending research questions about non-lethal symptoms of anatoxin exposure, but we expect things like gastrointestinal illness, numbness, different neurologic symptoms might be some of those non-lethal effects. And then, like we saw with that dog, high enough dose does lead to respiratory paralysis and death. Definitely something to be concerned about and a public health risk. And then in Zion, this was particularly concerning because this is one of the most busy national parks in the nation. The park receives 5 million visitors every year, and the majority of those visitors want to play, splash, and swim in the Virgin River where the cyanobacteria was found. This is a photo of the Zion Narrows, and you can just see these masses of people hiking and playing in the water. Big public health confrontation for the state of Utah, trying to figure out how to respond. And then as well as we started looking and being aware of benthic cyanobacteria, we quickly realized that this was not an isolated occurrence, but in fact, we have found toxigenic benthic cyanobacteria throughout our state. This map shows water bodies around Utah with confirmed benthic cyanobacteria. So you can see, everywhere from our high mountains to our deserts spread throughout the state. And frankly, more dots get added to this map every year. Benthic cyanobacteria is everywhere, and the more places you look, the more places you find it. Just a few pictures of what benthic cyanobacteria in Utah looks like, and this might be similar to what you've seen in your systems. These are pictures from flowing systems, so we have plenty of benthic cyanobacteria in our rivers and streams, everything from these green veiny mats to brown veiny mats to more the nostoc, the black boba balls is how I like to think about them. And then as well, this has been an issue in our standing water. These are two images from one of our really popular state parks. So we have a reservoir that is a state park and then also serves as a drinking water source that unfortunately is plagued by a lot of submerged benthic cyanobacteria. So mats grow anywhere between 15 to 30 feet underwater with tremendous amounts of coverage. You can see this one underwater image. This mat is about the size of a twin mattress. And the concern here is that these mats, they're photosynthesizing, they're producing oxygen as a byproduct. And once enough oxygen gets trapped in the mat, they actually will have these mass detachment events where they float up to the surface and then are available, to be eaten by dogs or come in contact with recreators and also come in contact with the drinking water intake. So this has also been a big concern we've had to deal with in Utah. Some things we've learned so far. I talk about one of our big concerns with these benthic cyanobacteria mats is toxin production. And so really, we like to think about the mats in Utah in two different categories based on their cyanobacteria order. So order Nostocales, which includes nostoc, again, these big black gelatinous pearls. We see this pretty prolifically throughout a lot of our streams and rivers in particular. Something I've done in the last few years is looking at just the historic samples we've collected as part of our monitoring, where we've had, a sample of a pretty pure, all one order of cyanobacteria and then a paired toxin. And for order Nostocales, we've actually seen fairly low toxin production. So this is our better cyanobacteria agent. Only 8% of the time do we see toxin detection. And very rarely is that toxin detection high with order Nostocales, 3%. And all of those samples were right in our first days of collecting cyanobacteria and a little suspicious. So most of the time, we don't see high toxin production with these species. In contrast, and these are the mats we really worry about, for order Oscillatoriales, we've seen very prolific toxin production in Utah. So of all our paired samples, 63% of the time, some amount of toxin has been detected, and nearly half of samples have had high anatoxin A detection. So anatoxin over 8 micrograms per liter. So this is particularly concerning to us. And as we've been trying to figure out where to prioritize attention and response and in public health communication, this has really guided it that, benthic cyanobacteria in oscillatory alleys is definitely our greatest concern because there's such a high chance that toxin production might be occurring. The other thing we've learned is that even though we know toxin production is common, the distribution of toxins is really variable, even within a very isolated geographic area. So up here is a picture of oscillatoriales mat in one of our river systems. Basically, all of this caramel tan gooey stuff is benthic cyanobacteria. And frequently we'll see this sort of distribution. This mat over here might not be producing any toxins. One section of mat is just pumping out toxins. Another section of mat is kind of moderate toxins. And then the surrounding water has very little to no toxin. So that also has been a big consideration as we've decided how to monitor and advise the public, is just recognizing that one mat is in no ways representative of the entire story of toxin threat in an area. The other thing that we've learned as a state, and honestly are still grappling with it, is trying to also connect the presence of these benthic mats to human and animal health effects. Zion was obviously a really high profile occurrence of benthic cyanobacteria. And throughout, from 2020 on, whenever visitors to the park develop symptoms after exposure to the Virgin River, park personnel point them to our Utah poison control. And so since 2020, depending on the year, we've had anywhere from 60 to 240 reports of human illnesses from folks who have been recreating in areas with benthic cyanobacteria in Zion. And this has been an interesting way to keep at least a little bit of a pulse on these sort of health effects. But this is challenging. This might be something you've run into. There's no really quick, easy ways to confirm if the reason someone is sick is because they've been exposed to antitoxin or benthic cyanobacteria, or if it's just that they were traveling or ate something weird or got sick for another reason. What we have seen, though, is that most common GI symptoms are reported in association with these illnesses about 2/3 of the time. And then unfortunately, we still have continued to see at least a handful of dog deaths every year around our state. I just pulled the last two that I was aware of. So one back last fall, a dog playing at that reservoir during a time when those mats had detached and were floating on the surface. And then just a couple of months ago, a dog playing in one of our rivers that has those benthic cyanobacteria mats. So tragically, I think we probably have even more dog deaths and effects than public agencies are aware of. And they oftentimes do act as the canary in identifying these sort of issues because they're much more likely to eat toxic cyanobacteria and frequently, because of their lower weights, more sensitive to lethal effects than a human adult would be. So what has Utah done so far in response to these occurrences? Just about 2 years ago, Utah came out with a specific benthic cyanobacteria guidance and advisory system with two different levels of public education and advisory. And I apologize, these slides are a little pixelated. The real ones are nice and crisp. Basically a check first general awareness education level, just to give the public a heads up when low levels of benthic cyanobacteria are present. So signs like this green one are actually manufactured in aluminum, 3 by 4 feet, and posted at a lot of really high recreational use areas where benthic cyanobacteria is present. And then also a more formal warning advisory exists. This is when we're seeing high concentrations or high risk amounts of benthic cyanobacteria, and activities like swimming are not advised. I'm happy to go more into this advisor direction if folks are interested. Here is just a quick snapshot of what those thresholds are, either to share general public awareness information with the public or issue a formal warning advisory. That distinction is based primarily on the amount of coverage of benthic cyanobacteria. So when there is less than 20% coverage in a high recreational use water body, educational signs are typically sufficient. When there is 20% or more coverage of benthic cyanobacteria in a high recreational use area, that's when that formal warning advisory would be issued. And the one exception to that is these high recreational risk scenarios where, say, you have a lot of detaching, floating, accumulating mats, or other conditions that might make it really likely that folks would come into contact with cyanobacteria. And then finally, just one more side note on that advisory guidance, put a QR code here if you are curious to really deep dive on that. But that coverage percent is derived by doing transects in either standing or flowing water. And don't go too far into this unless you want to, but basically doing point coverage. So we'll use these little PVC grids to look and basically count how many times benthic cyanobacteria is directly beneath an intersection on the grid. Do that 250 times across about 50 meters. And that allows us to calculate a really numeric and unbiased measure of percent coverage in an area. One side note is, this method works really good in streams and rivers that are wadable because you just wade across it. You can see underneath the water, no problem. It's also been pretty successful on our standing water that have lots of shallow water using that lower method. But it's been really tricky in our deeper lakes and reservoir, like these images I showed you earlier, where we have the benthic mats accumulating at depth. And this has been a challenge we've run into, is that frequently we weren't aware there was a big benthic mat problem until you're getting these massive detachment events, and now you're in crisis. And so something that my research group has just started working on this summer is coordinating with the state park and also the water district that manages this reservoir, and coming up with a better quantifiable method to get coverage in these lake submerged systems. So we have been using these aquatic robots, little submarines that basically can dive down, collect video and images of the subsurface, and then are currently developing a machine learning process, which will allow us to then feed in that video to a computer program, which will interpret and quantify how much cyanobacteria there is. And we're really excited about this so that we can apply the same sort of numeric coverage percent to these lacustrine systems. Our hope here is to be able to get really accurate information about how coverage in this reservoir is changing over time. The Water Conservancy District has also been treating this area of cyanobacteria with algicide, hydrogen peroxide, trying to kill it or at least reduce its number. So this is also going to be helpful in determining how effective those treatments are, and then ultimately in predicting and being able to forecast when these big detachment floating mat events are going to happen. So some exciting research on the horizon. Feel free to reach out if you want to be kept posted as we keep developing this process for this lake. Okay, gonna pause for just a second, take a drink of water. And then talk briefly about, so that again, very high level overview about what Utah, and especially the state of Utah, has been doing, first of all, the problem we've ran into, and thus far how we're responding to benthic cyanobacteria in both recreational and drinking water sources. Want to talk as well about now some of the research I'm working on at Brigham Young University, which I think really is informed by some of the patterns we've seen on benthic cyanobacteria distribution throughout this more routine and recreational monitoring work we've done since 2020. And one of the big goals for my current research is trying to figure out what sort of things control benthic cyanobacteria distribution, and what can we use to forecast or predict when benthic cyanobacteria will occur, and when toxins might be at the highest risk. So just want to highlight a few of our preliminary findings in that regard, and then talk about the work that's currently ongoing to really nail that down. So first of all, Utah, we are a fairly arid state, and especially in southwestern Utah areas like Zion National Park, we have pretty dramatic weather patterns when it comes to rain and precipitation. This is a graph showing discharge in the continuous lines along the North Fork of the Virgin River, which is that river where the dog unfortunately died in 2020. I just have a little snapshot here of discharge in 2020 and 2021 because it shows really well the sort of weather patterns we see. Typically, we'll have really high discharge every spring as snow melts and we get lots of snow water runoff. That will really peak discharge. Discharge then will drop down and stay fairly low throughout the rest of the spring and early summer. And then generally around mid-July, we have monsoonal rain patterns where we'll get really heavy rainstorms, lots of brief, dramatic bursts of precipitation, which will spike discharge really briefly, and also turn our rivers chocolate milk brown, wipe a bunch of debris downstream, cause these big flooding events, and then things will settle and that might repeat as frequently as weekly. And so what we've seen is that this has a really profound effect on benthic cyanobacteria growth in these systems. Spring runoff, this really high flow event effectively flushes out benthic cyanobacteria, scours it, removes it, disperses it, clears the system. So generally spring runoff removes all benthic cyanobacteria from the system. Cyanobacteria starts coming back. These little blue dots are basically positive toxin detections we're seeing in the system. So cyanobacteria starts to come back once that spring runoff dies and persist, increases in coverage, but then those monsoon rain events, these chocolate milk, high discharge floods, basically clear things again, wipe out the cyanobacteria. It gets cleared from the system. Once monsoon season ends in October, then once again, cyanobacteria starts mounting. So this has been really helpful for us in just figuring out, what are the temporal constraints on when cyanobacteria can occur in a lot of our Southwest systems. We also have seen a really big impact of shading and sunlight availability on benthic cyanobacteria distribution. Zion again offers a really nice example of that. This is a map showing the North Fork of the Virgin River. All of the red dots are areas where we saw benthic cyanobacteria last summer, pre-monsoon, and all of the green dots are areas where we could not find benthic cyanobacteria last year. And you'll see there's a really obvious cutoff point right here where no cyanobacteria north of it, a bunch of cyanobacteria south of it. And this is directly correlated with when the canyon tightens up and you're now getting so much shading that there's not enough light for the cyanobacteria to photosynthesize and thus establish itself. Here's just one picture of some of the narrowest areas where these green dots are. And you can imagine just dramatic enough of a landscape that you don't get much sun at all. And the same thing can happen in less dramatic topography from things like canopy shading. So if you have a really vegetated stretch of stream or river, we oftentimes see the same pattern where benthic cyanobacteria will not establish underneath that high canopy shade. So shading is another thing we're really looking at a bit more systematically this coming year because it acts as a control about spatially where habitat is suitable for benthic cyanobacteria to grow. And then finally, one other variable that we found here in Utah that I wanted to share is the role of nutrients. And things like nitrogen and phosphorus are a bit more obvious when it comes to their controls on planktonic or more traditional harmful algal bloom sort of cyanobacteria. It's a bit more complicated with benthic cyanobacteria, but we have found a pretty compelling correlation so far between areas where we have groundwater seeps and thus elevated nitrates in our water and the occurrence of benthic cyanobacteria. This is just one little example in the Virgin River down near the town of St. George, Utah. This is an area we have frequently had some issues with benthic cyanobacteria growing, and also has a number of seeps and elevated nitrates compared to other sections of the river adjacent to it. And just one picture, this is one of those areas where the seep is coming up, and we have benthic cyanobacteria growing right in that same area. So another thing we really want to pin down, and I think will help determine what are the areas, the constraints where benthic cyanobacteria really can thrive. So like I mentioned, we are now hitting this hard currently this summer, and in through the rest of this year. We have four different systems that we are conducting routine, but random probabilistic monitoring at, where we're looking at everything from how much benthic cyanobacteria is there, what sort of toxin concentrations are present, different genetic indicators, discharge, shading, nutrients, insects, and more. And we're really excited to have this quantitative data set, to continue to pin down some of those relationships, again, with the goal to be able to forecast and predict where benthic cyanobacteria is going to occur before it occurs so we can share that with water managers. So really excited about that, and feel free to reach out to me next year and happy to pass on additional data we've collected. But that, I think, is it for my high-level overview for now. Here is my email address, if you have any questions we don't get to or want to connect. And I will turn it back over to you guys for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions in the chat, and people are welcome to continue to put them in the chat. The first one is, why is fishing and wading okay for adults? Are we concerned about bioaccumulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things we have been trying to figure out with our guidance is how to hit a reasonable balance. As far as we're aware, cyanotoxins are not absorbed through the skin. Sometimes they can cause rashes or skin irritation, but you're not going to get a lethal dose or organ damage, from, just dermally coming in contact. And so that's what we felt, especially for adults who are not going to be, putting their hands in their mouth, that wading was appropriate. In terms of bioaccumulation in fish, that is also still an emerging area of research, and I think is pretty concerning when it comes to planktonic or traditional harmful algal blooms. With benthic cyanobacteria, it has been very, very rare for us to see any detectable toxins in the water column itself. Toxins tend to stay right within those benthic cyanobacteria cells and quickly are diluted if they get released to the water. And so we feel like that's a pretty low risk for bioaccumulation in fish.
Great. Thank you. The second question we have in the chat is, for benthic mats occurring at 15 to 30 foot depths, what practical indicators can monitors use to assess whether deeper mats may be present at a site?
Yeah, so I mean, initially, and how practical this is, the Water Conservancy District actually got scuba divers to go down, look around, and at least just qualitatively see what's there. Our more practical approach is you can actually get a drop cam if you're an angler or a fisherman. It's basically a camera on a stick that you can drop to different depths and either snap a photo or video. And that can be a really effective way to at least just get a general picture of what might be down there.
Great.
I'd
Uh,
like to I'd like to just sort of, hi, Jim Coleman here. I'd just like to
Sure.
continue on that same conversation because I work my benthic issue is on a river, but the river gets fairly deep in some areas. And I just always assumed that the water, the sunlight didn't penetrate very far um, down into the depths. And so I was kind of always under the assumption that we would only find benthics along the shoreline, but it sounds like you're describing something like you're finding them much deeper. Um, and this is in a lake that's 15 to 30 feet deep.
That's correct. And it is a very nice high water clarity lake. So, for example, the Colorado River, which is one of our really big rivers, is much more murky. So we have not seen benthic cyanobacteria at depths in that. So it probably depends a lot on what sort of light penetration your system has and how clear it is.
Yeah, well, we're finding on the Columbia, our water clarity is actually quite good. So I, I'm studying it so far. I've just done the wadeable depths, and so I'm only now starting to think that I need to go deeper. Because funny enough, there's this guy on Facebook that goes swimming in the Columbia. He has a camera and he dives under
Oh,
the water and he takes photos. And I saw one of these recently, and it's like, oh my God, he's seeing some benthics down. And I
oh my
said,
God.
oh, how far below the surface were you? And he says, oh, about 15 feet. And it's like, whoa. So very interesting, and thanks for your talk. Really enjoyed it. I see so many parallels to our own work. You guys are doing a fantastic job. You must have a lot of resources because um, our benthic research in Washington is pretty limited. But yeah, I have a lot to learn from you, I guess. So keep up the good work and enjoy. Looking forward to some new data coming out.
Thanks, Jim.
I'd like to replicate a lot of the things you guys are doing, but like I say, our resources are limited. And just the fact that you're sampling multiple pieces of a large mat is surprising to me because um, I just don't have enough money to sample multiple sites, and I'm just like when I see a mat, I'm just kind of taking a chunk of it. But now it sounds like um, I shouldn't always assume that the entire mat is having that same concentration of antitoxin or whatever.
Yeah, and I will say, Jim, as a former state employee, I totally get those resource constraints. I do feel really strongly that it's important to try and get a mixture of mats to get a toxin representation. Something we often do to kind of compensate for that, but only have to pay for one toxin analysis, is we just basically get equal size pinches of 8 to 10 mats and then stick them all in the sample bottle. And that's at least a nice way to get an average of toxins. You're not biasing yourself by, just unfortunately picking the one mat that didn't have any toxins or the one that had crazy
Right.
toxins.
Yeah.
So would say
We're
that
doing a
that can be
little
a
of
nice way
that
to at least get it mixed.
doing some compositing.
Great. Um, there is two more questions in the chat right now. One is, do you have a volunteer monitoring program? And I will kind of build on this. Have you ever worked with volunteer monitors and any advice for monitors that are going out and trying to identify benthic cyanobacteria or work with it?
Yeah, we call it our Utah Water Watch, which is a lot of our citizen scientists who will adopt a water body and help with weekly or biweekly monitoring. And so, as part of that, we have an annual training where we'll meet with the volunteers, show them a lot of photos, do some practice identification training. I'll be the first one to say benthic cyanobacteria can be really hard sometimes to identify. Diatoms, if you're familiar with them, trick me, I'd say like at least once or twice a year. And sometimes, unless you look at it under the microscope, it can be hard to know for sure. But even just looking at photos, you can get to a point pretty quickly where if there's just abundant, obvious, someone might really get sick amounts of cyanobacteria, you're going to be able to see it. So yeah, I think just giving volunteers the resource they need to really be able to have some good identification references is big. And then really nothing beats being able to go out in the field and actually squish cyanobacteria in your fingers. For me, the texture of benthic cyanobacteria is really the most positive identifying feature. So if you're able to take your volunteers out there and actually give them hands-on training, that really is huge.
Great. Thank you. Um, the other question is there a relationship to the geology of the area, like calcium available or something similar? Is there any other info for other relationships to other organisms going on?
Yeah, that is a great question that I'm so excited to hopefully find the answers to in the future. Things like specific conductivity, we've also seen a pretty positive correlation between benthic cyanobacteria. And more anecdotally, I've noticed even different rock types are sometimes more or less likely to have the mats growing on them. So I would not be surprised if there's some geology relations or, that tour is determining different elements. I know other research has shown even iron amounts can influence benthic cyanobacteria presence. So almost certainly there's some relationships there. We have not delved deep enough for me to give you a specific Utah answer. And then the second question, there was a second part of that question. Oh, macroinvertebrates, kind of like top-down controls. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that it also, and this is one of the really exciting things about benthic cyanobacteria. Just scientifically, it is new, and as a scientific community, we have so much to learn. Um, some evidence in the literature that top-down controls, so things like macroinvertebrates grazing on cyanobacteria, might have an influence on how prolific it is. That's something we're collecting macroinvertebrate samples and also going to be doing genetic tests on the contents of their guts to see, are macroinvertebrates eating mats in our areas? Is that changing the health of the macroinvertebrates? How are they being affected by the toxins? And then is that changing what kind of macroinvertebrates are present in different environments? So hopefully we'll be able to chip in on that work in the near future. But yeah, lots of good questions there.
Great. Um, Based on your image, the differences in concentration of toxins within a small area can vary widely. How do you manage translating that information to the public or in a technical sense in a way that feels true to the story that the data is telling?
We've tried a variety of approaches with this, and sometimes things just get generalized. So for the Narrows, the entire Narrows in Zion National Park is generally always under at least that educational level, just because we know people are going to be passing through those sections at one point. So I think sometimes we just have to generalize pretty broadly, even though, scientifically we recognize there's a bit more nuance. I think the direction, though, that Utah has been moving in the last year or so, though, is really ultimately trying to educate the public to be able to recognize benthic cyanobacteria themselves, and really putting the responsibility as much as possible back on recreators. The same way you need to learn how to recognize poison ivy so you don't go blundering through a patch. We don't want to shut down an entire forest or campground just because there's poison ivy there, or rattlesnakes is a big one here in Utah, or a trouble bear. But people also need to know how to properly take precautions to avoid really dangerous situations to themselves or their kids or dogs. So yeah, I think a combination of generalizing when necessary, but then also trying to educate and empower the public as much as possible.
I have a question specifically tied to informing the public. Do you ever find that there is confusion or kind of a misunderstanding with using benthic cyanobacteria versus cyanobacteria when most people expect those like bright green surface blooms? And how have you navigated that process and introducing this kind of, I think of it as like a whole new world of cyanobacteria.
No, exactly. It feels like the public was just starting to get planktonic cyanobacteria, and now it's brown and black and grows on the bottom on rocks, and it's really tricky. Um, for Utah, the two languages we have used is harmful algal blooms to describe planktonic events, and then harmful algae mats to describe benthic cyanobacteria. And I think especially involving the mat part has been helpful because it's a bit more intuitive that it's a concrete, solid thing and different than a bloom.
Um, Building on that with some of like the more Nostoc globule styles, was that similar of using kind of harmful algal globule style language?
Yeah, so it just still mats and yeah, Nostoc has been hard. I didn't get much into it. At least for now, if Nostoc mats are present in a water body, we still post the educational signage and specifically sub in photos of Nostoc so folks know what to look for. And honestly, I just say photos on signs is huge. because then at least it gives people a concrete image of, oh, this is what to look for. And when we've been putting up signs, we would try and put photos of specific benthic cyanobacteria we'd seen in that water body, just so it was really directly representative of what people might want to look out for. But yeah, Nostoc has been much lower priority in terms of communication and educating, just because it's so often less toxic than the more oscillatoriales species.
I know you covered that, Hannah, but to kind of piggyback off what you just said, um, you were talking about earlier on in the presentation how order Nostocales, that gets stuck in the mouth, often has less toxins in what you're finding. Did you speculate already or elaborate on why that might be? Is there anything that's obvious for why that could be the case?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess just a disclaimer, that has been true in Utah so far. I do not presume to say that is true for Nostoc everywhere. I think it's something worth checking just so, from a more managerial perspective, you can know where to focus. I would, if I were to speculate, I think just a lot more species of Nostoc are not toxin producers in the first place. And it's actually often a very specific species of Oscillatorialis, either Microcoleus autumnalis or Microcoleus anatoxicus, are just two really two very successful cyanobacteria species in our systems, and both just very frequently have the ability to produce anatoxin. So I think it's more just production potential in the first place. There's less species of Nostoc that produce these toxins, and they're not often the dominant species in a mat or in an area.
We
Great,
do
thanks.
have one parks question. So, do the parks departments enforce advisories, and do the signs stay up all the time depending on the coverage observed?
Yeah, so we work really closely with state parks, and actually for Utah State Parks, working with the Division of, I keep saying we, I guess formerly we, in Utah Division of Water Quality, have come up with some agreements and just expectations. Really depends. Typically, these are temporary signs, because for most of our parks, these are not year-round occurrences. So there are temporary signs that go up when there's the risk and then can come down at other times. There's one park in particular, and I guess we've talked about it, the one with the reoccurring, where there are some permanent educational signs. And again, we tried to make those more like a friendly check first, just telling folks to be on the lookout for cyanobacteria before dogs or kids specifically get in. And hopefully, if I didn't answer all that, please chime in. Did I miss anything on that state parks question?
I think you got it. I also, the document you had put in with the QR code earlier had some guidance in there for the posting warnings and educational
Mm.
information too. So I'm happy to put a link in the chat for people to check out as well. Um, we have a couple more questions. So, do you have any more data on the toxicity of drawing drinking water from areas that have benthic mats?
Yeah, so again, that's what I was mentioning. The good news is that, generally the amount of toxins, an entire water body compared to the volume of water is actually quite low. And so what we've seen is that you're not oftentimes seeing even detectable toxins in the water column just ambiently. The exception to that is if you disturb mats. So, say I were to go tramp all over a mat and then like scoop up a water bottle to drink, there might temporarily be high toxins in that water. But if I just were to sample the water without disturbance, very unlikely to detect them. And so fortunately for the reservoir I mentioned that is the drinking water source, they obviously are monitoring very closely their intake, and thus far have not seen any toxin detection. I think the concern is if the intake started sucking in mat material itself, that would really be the problem.
Great. Um, have there been seasonal variants that indicate toxin production? And is there a connection when both Gliotrichia and Nostoc are present?
Yeah, so seasonally, we definitely have seen both more prolific growth, so higher mat coverage and higher toxins. Have not been able to figure out yet if that's just there's more mats, so there's more toxins or more toxin production per mat. That's another question we're hoping to be able to answer with this more holistic coverage data set. But warmer temperatures, so spring and summer before monsoon season, and then early fall are our highest toxic periods, and also our warmest temperatures. And then remind me the second part.
Um, is there a connection when both gliotrichia and nostoc are present?
Yeah, we haven't seen any gliotrichia, like I assume planktonically or benthically co-occurring with our nostocs, so I will not hazard an answer to that one.
Thank you. There are no more questions in the chat right now. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, this is Jim Coleman. I have a question. It has to do with worker safety.
Mm.
Henny, you mentioned that you didn't think there was much of a danger from dermal exposure, and then you alluded to waiting. Are you waiting? I mean, are some of your field workers waiting without waiters? So basically, going in without protection,
Mm.
I guess.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. This is my unofficial, un-OSHA approved answer, Jim. So take it with a grain of salt. I mean, I guess first of all, a cautionary tale. Prior to the dog death and everyone's discovery of the benthic cyanobacteria in Zion, they had an irrigation worker who was actually clearing out irrigation channels of vegetation to keep the flow of water good. And unfortunately, those irrigation channels were full of a lot of benthic cyanobacteria. So, day after day, he was barehandedly pulling out mats of cyanobacteria. And he did develop permanent hearing loss, vertigo, and some pretty bad chronic neurologic effects. So, but he also was, pulling it out day after day, eating his lunch without washing his hands, touching his face. So I don't mess around. Anything I touch with cyanobacteria is not going to touch my face. I always wear gloves when I'm sampling or touching mats and wash my hands really thoroughly with soap and water. Again, because hand sanitizer is not going to do anything. You've got to mechanically remove it. So I think that's really important. I personally, unless there's really thick, stagnant benthic cyanobacteria, will not wear waders just because I generally feel like there's enough flow in our rivers and streams that it's all being washed away and I'm not just perpetually being in contact with it. If I'm wading in like a pond or a lake with really nasty benthic cyanobacteria that's just going to be floating around me, that's when I'll wader up.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. It gets pretty hot here. And we were out just last week and it was about 95 degrees and we were on chest waders and we're all kind of like, well, do we really need chest waders and whatever?
Yeah.
But there were some spots that are pretty densely populated. But we have a real strong current flow. So yeah, thanks for your input.
Yeah, I feel that. And it's same. It's like if I'm going to be out there in 100-degree temperatures for 8 hours, I feel like it might actually be a better move for my safety not to be dying in waders, especially when
Right.
there's lots of nice clean water flowing all around me.
Choosing the riskiest hazard in the moment.
Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Oh, go ahead, John.
I saw that you have a submersible drone program that you're talking about.
Correct.
Are there any points of contact or anything? Because I guess I'll show myself. Hello. Wait. Is it
John.
okay? Hello. I am in my workshop and I'm developing a little
Oh,
right now. So I'm just curious if there's any like points of contact or any resources, maybe like engineering notes or something that I could access potentially.
yeah, John, I just threw my email again in the chat if you didn't see it. I'm working with a couple of engineering professors here at BYU, and if you just want to shoot me an email, happy to connect you with them. That's really
Awesome.
cool.
Thanks so much.
Mhm.
Any final questions before we wrap up?
I guess mine's not a question, but I have a little bit of a question, a comment on related to the drone footage that you're using. I know you said that you were using machine learning in part of your monitoring related to that. A couple of years ago, we did an ROV project in an area with an endangered species present, and we felt like a great way to monitor without being intrusive would be the underwater ROV. So it recorded footage, and I physically had to watch the videos and count how many of this species were present. But I'm wondering, is that how the machine learning is being used in your situation? Is that how you're using it, is when the footage is being reviewed, or in some other way?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe we could get instantaneous once the algorithms are trained. So at least for this initial stage, it's training the computer how to recognize benthic cyanobacteria. So it is a lot of me looking at videos and being like, yes, that's it. No, it's not. To develop at that. But then, yeah, ultimately the goal is that, some occasional QC will need to happen just to make sure the computer's not going crazy. But the computer itself will make all those calls and be able to generate a coverage percent from that.
Very cool.
So that could be a much slicker version next time you do the aquatic species. Just train a computer to count all of them for you. And AI has come so far, and just the ability to these visual recognitions has progressed tremendously the last couple of years.
So can I tag on to that? Going back to your assessment on the rivers where you used like a transect and then I mean, to me that just sounds pretty time consuming. I was just wondering if you couldn't use something like a GoPro with a wide angle, like a fisheye lens, and just take a photo, and maybe you've got like a photo of a 20-foot square, and then go back to the lab and just count the brown squares and then train software to so then you could just have a series of photographs and come up with an assessment like that. What do you think about that? Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a cool idea, Jim. One of the things you run into is frequently there's enough surface reflection that, just taking a photo itself, it can be really hard to see the benthos. So I should have included a picture. We'll use a bathyoscope. I don't know if folks are
Yeah,
familiar
I
with
know what
that.
those
Yeah.
are.
Just so you can get past the surface tension, but it could be cool, especially if we get this algorithm for the lakes working to then just take like a video of like trolling the bathyoscope, through that viewer, and give it a shot. So I think it's a great idea. I'll try it out and let you know how it goes, Jim.
Yeah,
And I'd say
well,
the other thing that folks do is some group in Montana is using drones with like a hyperspectral camera, that can actually look at phycocyanin signatures, trying to do this in really shallow
yeah,
rivers.
those
So
are pretty
that also
expensive. Those are
cool.
pretty
But
expensive pieces of
yeah.
equipment. But we tried drone, just a regular drone, just earlier this week, and it seems to be promising. It looks like it has limitations, but there's some promise there.
Yeah, I think California, maybe this is who you've chatted with, has done a bit of drone imagery, especially when they get really widespread. And it's kind of just like anything that shows up black is probably cyanobacteria. So I think there's some precedent in systems that works pretty well.
Do you know what group that is?
I'm guessing it was California Water Boards, maybe Rich
Yeah,
Faddis.
they've done a lot of good work. Um,
That's an
Great.
interesting idea. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, if you figure out any cool drone things, please keep me posted. Because it is, I mean, I can do a full transect in about 30 minutes. So yeah, it's not, it does take a bit of a time investment.
Great. Is there
yeah,
any?
I'd like to talk to you sometime about that, more detail. Thanks.
We do have one more question in the chat if you are okay, and then we can wrap it up
Of
because we're
course.
getting close to time. Is there an overlap when planktonic cyanobacteria and benthic cyanobacteria are co-occurring in the same area? And are the toxins more or less often detected with benthic species?
Yeah, we definitely have seen overlap. That reservoir I was talking about. We've also seen some kind of isolated areas of planktonic bloom there. So absolutely they can co-occur. And maybe especially if you have enriched groundwater seeps or these nutrient things that would favor benthic cyanobacteria could also really pave the way for planktonic. So definitely not exclusive of each other. I don't know if anyone has really come up with a definite answer about whether one enhances the other or not. And then in terms of toxins, I think what I've seen is that the type of toxin most commonly seen really varies. Here in Utah and around the world, microcystins are the most commonly associated toxin with planktonic blooms. Antitoxin tends to be much less commonly seen with planktonic blooms. In contrast, antitoxin is very common with a lot of these benthic cyanobacteria species. And microsystems are a lot less common. So I'd say, more from a monitoring perspective, knowing what's most likely can be really helpful to know where to focus your sampling and analysis.
Right. Thank you so much for your time and for spending your Tuesday East Coast time afternoon with us. And you are getting multiple thank you so much and fantastic presentations in the chat. So I am going to stop the recording and I will post the recording on our website tomorrow and follow up via email.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anna.